Elena Morales kept a small notebook she called receipts. It wasn't for money, it was for things that couldn't be erased. Promises, signatures, the faces of people who smiled at her misfortune. She'd started the book after her mother's sudden bankruptcy, after phone calls that ended with polite apologies and friendships that loosened like old buttons. The last name on the first page was Marco Ruiz. Marco had been her brother's best friend, the kind of man who could light a room and convince people not to look at the scorch marks afterward. Charming, eloquent, always perfectly on his side of a conversation. He'd taken over the family's small bakery when Elena's mother fell ill. To help, he'd insisted, in that warm, disarming voice. Years later, the bakery was Marco's, framed now in glossy glass, and a logo Elena had never been paid for. Her mother's recipes had been altered into a brand, her mother's suppliers folded into a lucrative network, and the Morales name quietly disappeared. The first act of revenge was small. Elena started by taking receipts. She sat at the corner table of Marco's cafe on rainy Tuesdays and logged details. A supplier who preferred cash. A contract copied and signed in a shaky hand. A voicemail saved in case someone later denied the exact words. Her receipts grew into an archive. Invoices, emails, witness accounts. But receipts alone don't topple a man like Marco. You need pressure, a system, and the right audience. Elena didn't want him arrested. She wanted him exposed. Arrests are loud, exposure is precise. She wanted the kind of exposure that left no room for redemption. So she built a plan that used 3 things she was excellent at: patience, disguise, and an understanding of the one weakness Marco never bothered to check: his appetite for recognition. She started small. Anonymously sent a glowing feature tip to a local food journalist about the reinvented Morales conchas. The bakeries raved. The journalist called Marco a genius. The article went viral in the city's food circles. Marco tweeted a proud, arrogant thank you. Elena watched from the shadows and smiled. She just baited the first hook. Next, she introduced Ava, an interior designer with a taste for nostalgic logos, on a freelance site. Ava was Elena in a different hairline and a borrowed portfolio. She pitched a revival campaign to modernize Marco's brand for an international buyer. Marco, desperate to please the journalist-fueled market and hungry for expansion, bit. Ava requested early access to the archive of recipes and supply lists as part of her brand audit. Marco sent scanned contracts, the same contracts Elena already had, and invited Ava for a consult over coffee. On the morning of their meeting, Elena stood outside the cafe in a raincoat with a fake name, listening. Marco arrived late, smiling that dangerous smile. For the first time since the bakery had been his, he did something reckless. He bragged. To the barista, to a supplier in the corner, to Ava, and most importantly, he bragged to a man he thought was merely a decorative investor at the next table. The investor was one of Elena's allies, a quiet accountant whose company had been hurt by Marco's supplier deals. He made a careful, casual remark about an offshore purchase and the off-book ledger. Marco laughed it off, but the auditor's attention was caught. The plan unfolded like a clock. Elena fed the journalist a second tip, this one subtler, a rumor that Marco's expansion relied on a legacy recipe under dispute. The journalist, smelling scandal, asked for proof. Elena released a doctored but plausible invoice showing a consultancy fee paid to a shell company connected to a name Marco had used at a late-night poker game. The city's food blog ran a piece titled, "When a Recipe Becomes Property, the Shadow Contracts of Famous Bakeries." The piece invited comment. Marco replied with an angry op-ed about entrepreneurship and theft, and in his anger, he used the exact legal phrase proving he'd known the contract terms Elena had suspected. Public attention rippled outward. A small but powerful union of former suppliers, now organized online, posted side-by-side pictures of shipments Marco's new company had accepted and invoices from the Morales family. Elena watched the edges of Marco's world fray like old wallpaper. But the real sting, the part that made people listen to the end, came in the form of a staged generosity. Elena organized a grassroots pop-up community bake sale honoring forgotten bakers. She invited the press, community leaders, and of course Marco. She made sure the event's poster carried a clever tagline: "What we make together belongs to all of us." The pop-up was a hit. People stood in line for hours, telling their stories of recipes taken, wages unpaid, and promises broken. On camera, in front of a crowd, Elena delivered a short, raw speech about gratitude, debt, and memory, about a mother who taught her to knead by hand and how those hands were replaced by a brand team. Marco arrived, furious and flustered. He tried to interrupt, but the camera angles had been set. The live stream was rolling, and the comments poured in. The pop-up had reminded the city of the human faces behind the food. Donations flooded an online fund for the displaced suppliers, and the most painful thing for Marco, customers who had once loved his cafe now called for a boycott until restitution had been arranged. Confronted publicly, Marco floundered. The accountants Elena had quietly recruited compiled a tight, irrefutable dossier showing irregular payments, misappropriated receipts, and misrepresented ownership claims. A regulatory review was opened. The brand that had seemed untouchable was now embroiled in civil suits and damning headlines. But Elena's plan had a final, deliberate twist. She could have taken everything: the bakery, the brand, the lawsuit money. Instead, she offered something people rarely expect from revenge: a chance to tell the truth. Facing mounting evidence, Marco agreed to a public listening session, not a courtroom, but a televised town hall. Elena could have destroyed him there. Instead, she sat across from him, calm, and read aloud from her receipts, the emails, the voicemails, the names. She told the story not as accusation but as memoir, chapter by chapter. When she finished, she looked at Marco and said, gently, "Pay them back, and you can keep the good you built. Hide, and you lose everything." Marco chose to make amends in public. He read an apology, thin, legal, and rehearsed, then signed restitution agreements drafted by the suppliers group. There were ugly moments, denials, tears, threats. But in the end, the suppliers were paid, the original recipes were returned to Elena's mother's ledger, and Marco's brand lost its glossy new investors. He lost more than profit. He lost the public's trust and, crucially, the comfortable oblivion he'd relied on. Elena closed her notebook and burned the very last page. Not because revenge had satisfied her completely, but because the last receipt was a closure she had written herself. She walked by the bakery months later. A small sign in the window read, "Specials, Morales family recipes." Elena paused, then kept walking. She didn't need the bakery. She needed the book to be empty. She had gotten her receipt. Please like, subscribe, and turn on the bell notification for more interesting stories. Don't forget to share this video with your loved ones and friends. Thank you.